Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our second in a series of discussions hosted by the Val-Kill Partnership, the Open Society University Network, Bard College, and the Telwar Network. The series came about in conversation with the Val-Kill Partnerships Board. I'm the secretary of that board, as we reflected in the past few months on what Eleanor would do in the time of COVID. Val-Kill, which is Eleanor's home, is the only national park dedicated to a First Lady, and it's located in Hyde Park, which is about 20 minutes away from Bard's Annandale campus. And it's where Eleanor hosted the world, literally, from local school children, farmers and workers, all the way up to world leaders. She was about bringing people together. She was about creating community, amplifying voices, and she was about deep listening. National and international events in the past weeks, especially in the last 10 days here in the US, are the deadly cost paid by communities when leaders do not listen, do not work to lift us up, and do not strive to bring us together. This is a time for deep reflection and action, which are two hallmarks of Eleanor's work. And we are proud to be able to speak to that in the coming months. Our new partnership allows us to think deeply about Eleanor's legacy, about where we are today, and to find a way to act as we strive to return to a world that we want. The Open Society University Network is a partnership between Bard College, Central European University, and the Open Society Network. It creates academic programs, supports civic engagement across geographic and demographic boundaries. That includes research, network classes, academic programs, and international mobility. The Telwar Network is an international association of institutions committed to strengthening the civic roles and social responsibilities of higher education institutions that has built a global movement of engaged universities. Telwar joined with OSIN to launch the series alongside a call for submissions for a student award for students who have pivoted their engagement work during the time of COVID. And we are in the process of identifying the winners of that award, which was due yesterday. Eleanor Roosevelt is the chair of the Eleanor Roosevelt Val-Kill Partnership, a private nonprofit that works in tandem with the National Park Service for the enhancement of visitors' experience at the home of Eleanor Roosevelt. She has worked tirelessly to lift Eleanor's legacy, and I'm lucky to know her, and I'm joined with her today. So I'm going to turn the floor over to her to introduce our wonderful guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to our colleagues and the students that are joining us today from as far as 10 hours ahead, I'm being told. So good morning and good evening to you all, and thank you for being here today with us. We have a very exciting and wonderful guest who will speak to us about topics that are hot right now. The series of conferences is called Tomorrow is Now, and that is the title of the book that Eleanor wrote in 1962 as she lay in bed dying. It is now available as a paperback with a new introduction by President Bill Clinton and a foreword by Alida Black, Eleanor's biographer. And it was reissued in 2012. Eleanor wrote Tomorrow is Now specifically for the younger generation, you all, with more tomorrows ahead in your lives than yesterdays. And it is a call to action, a kind of manifesto for Americans and other world citizens to shape today the world we want to live in for tomorrow. Eleanor was 78 when she wrote this book. She had written 30 other books. Her nationally syndicated column, My Day, had appeared 6 days a week in newspapers since 1936. She had written 550 articles and had spent 50 years in the political arena, fighting to make America a more equitable society for all. She so much wanted to complete this manifesto that she endured high fevers, tremors, and persistent fatigue. Her voice was so faint that she had to repeat herself over and over to be heard by the lady who was taking her dictation. Eleanor was adamant that she wanted tomorrow's now to be her last words for the world, her last ideas and concepts that she hoped would inspire the next generation to bold action and strong commitment to shape society by getting involved and abandoning all complacency. Today, we're so lucky to be here with Joel Rosenthal, President of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in Foreign Affairs. Joel is also an adjunct professor and chairman of the Bard College Globalization and International Affairs program in New York City. The Carnegie Council was created in 1914. That same summer, the world blindly stepped into what would become World War I. And the Council's underpinning vision is that ethics in international affairs is a pillar of a set of international standards by which leaders and countries and individuals collaborate across cultural, political, and social differences. Joel, you have been at the helm of bringing this foundational vision into the 21st century, and I would say you have succeeded brilliantly. We're here together at this extraordinary juncture, when the world is on pause due to COVID pandemic, and here in the States, we're witnessing, again, mass rage and social and racial inequalities now spreading to 140 cities across the country. The anger will not heal. Eleanor Roosevelt was a champion for civil rights earlier than most. Her work to heal the divide was considered so outrageous by right-wing groups that the Ku Klux Klan placed the highest bounty on her head they had ever placed on any human being. And there were 19 assassination attempts made against her. She was a very courageous lady, and she used her public stance to fight to heal divisions. We're in this all together. Joel, the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs was founded more than a century ago by a visionary philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie. And the Council has been one of the world's top creators of nonpartisan educational resources on international ethics, used today by professionals, journalists, educators, students, and the greater public. Can you tell us what the Council is doing today to create a better tomorrow and your leadership in this process?
Manuela and Erin, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to be with you this morning and to be with all of the constituents, students, faculty of the OSIN network all around the world for this really important conversation. I want to thank you for the opportunity. When Erin was introducing at the beginning, she talked about Eleanor's example of deep reflection and action. It's a very powerful combination. And I believe that when the Carnegie Council was founded in that momentous year of 1914 with the world convulsing, it was founded with the same idea, that this was a moment for deep reflection and action, and that the two could be combined. And one of the virtues of the Carnegie Council is to be able to draw upon examples like Andrew Carnegie in his best moments, and Eleanor Roosevelt and her legacy, to see what we can take from the past, what we can learn from the past, and bring it to the present, and then crucially to imagine a better future. We can talk a little bit more about ethics and what we mean by ethics, and how the Council's organized around the principle of ethics. But if you take anything away from this conversation, I hope you'll think about ethics as how we should live, the choices that we make, and that is connected to our experience in the world today, but to a better future, that is literally in our hands. And I'll come back to that phrase in a moment. But Manuela, you asked what the Carnegie Council is doing, and I'll just give you a brief summary. We hope we're providing some thought leadership, the ideas that can lead us to a better future. We're providing educational resources for professionals who are working in areas of public policy, but also for general audience and also crucially for younger people. In addition to those educational resources, we're providing opportunities for engagement. And also we're trying to provide connection as we're doing today. This is one of the reasons I'm so excited about the activities that the Roosevelt legacy, that Val Kill and all of the Roosevelt legacy institutions and BARD together are creating. I think this is really crucial to build constituency and to build network around these issues.
Thank you. I'm going to take some of the titles in Eleanor's book, Tomorrow's Now, as an inspiration for our conversation. The second chapter is titled America the Unready. And Eleanor referred to the fact that the reality of one nation indivisible is a promise yet to be delivered. In the last few days, we see rage and race riots across 140 cities. Joel, could you tell us, why do we keep not listening to the plight of the unheard? Why is it seemingly so difficult to heal the rage of the social divide? And again, how does your work and the Council's work help illuminate the path forward? And if you could speak about deep listening.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that you know, the simple answer to your question is a failure to listen, and a confusion about what leadership is and should be. I think that frequently we have this model of leadership as being hierarchical, of being vertical, right? We even had the president yesterday using words of domination, right? That this is somehow the model of leadership that we seem to be working under. And Eleanor Roosevelt provided a very different model, which I think is something to think about this morning. As you say, deep listening. As you mentioned, she went into the community. She listened. And this was the basis of her leadership, to understand you know, the different voices, the different experiences. And I think this is a deep ethical commitment. And it's perhaps the primary one that I can think of when you really boil it down, is to imagine yourself in the shoes of another person. Imagine the lived experience of someone else, of another human being. And the ethical principle that we speak about at Carnegie Council is the principle of pluralism. And it's actually quite a deep philosophical idea. In its essence, it means understanding the diversity and even embracing the diversity of experience. We all have a different lived experience, all of us. No matter how close we are, it's different. However, we all share something common in the human experience. And this is sort of the riddle or the conundrum, right, of pluralism, right? That we're all different and we're all the same. And so this is the essential insight. And so again, coming back to Eleanor, how do you process that? How do you channel that? How do you take that in and then turn that into leadership in a certain direction? And the way we've tried to do that at Carnegie Council is to try to be as inclusive as we can as we're looking at a particular issue in public life. The first thing is, certainly you want experts, you want people who have studied that issue, who understand that issue, who have some analytical abilities in that issue. but you also want to get people who have experienced something from a variety of different ways. You know, in sort of in the social science jargon, it would be a multi-sector analysis, right? We want people from that have experienced this issue from the top, from the bottom, from the side, right, in different ways, and put that all together. So I'd like to think that the Carnegie Council is trying to, in some ways, exhibit or be an exemplar of how to both listen and lead as we organize our convenings and our publications, that you'll get a variety of views, but they'll all try to bring ethics to the front and also to suggest a particular direction, if not a specific answer.
So you're right in Eleanor being an unusual leader because she listened so deeply. She would travel to the South, where she knew her life was threatened. She refused the protection of the Secret Service. She refused to carry a gun. She was given one, but she kept it in the car. She would sit in churches with African Americans who were roiling over with still very, very, very deeply unfair conditions. And she would listen and she would talk. And that was the beginning of her understanding what civil rights and later human rights could heal. But she was part of it. She made herself part of it. She listened to the rage. She was not frightened of the very, very, very strong emotions after every lynching and after every murder. If we continue, her third chapter is titled Revolution. And she explained that during her lifetime, revolutions took place on every continent and in every form, political, economic, ideological. What is the revolution today, Joel? Can you contextualize the ethical crisis we live in now, with democracy in retreat against rising tides of nationalism and isolation, and further inflamed by COVID and the financial losses of this period? We feel very much we are in a revolution.
Yeah.
And the past is breaking apart.
Yeah. I think that there's sort of two moments of revolution right now. One is genuinely new, and one is a legacy, if you will, or continues with us. And I'll start with the new one first. We are going through a period now that in some ways mirrors what Andrew Carnegie's world 100+ years ago was. The transition at Carnegie's time was a transition into an industrial world. This was a huge change. It was really what the Industrial Revolution had brought to society. And huge change in that period of time. And we see it in the great social movements of the progressive era, right? It really was a convulsive time. It brought us World War I, but it also brought us, great strides in terms of labor rights, women's suffrage, just huge changes in our society. But that was a transition into an industrial world. What we're facing today is a transition into a post-industrial world, if you will, a world driven by incredible advances in science and technology. And now that we're living through it, it's probably hard for us to see it, but it's happening very, very fast. We see it in the biological sciences. We now have the ability to literally to manipulate life, to engineer life, whether it's plants or animals or human beings, right? This technology is now, to use that phrase, in our hands. We have it. We see it in now increasingly in the ability to engineer the climate, right? this is something that's coming on quite quickly right now. It's an issue we're looking at Carnegie Council. How do we deal with the changing climate, and how will human beings and how will society deal with that to perhaps try to engineer the climate? So tremendous changes. We see tremendous changes in the virtual world, if you will. This is a new world, a world that wouldn't have even been understood over 100 years ago. The virtual world, well, cyberspace, artificial intelligence, means of surveillance, things like this, right? So we're living through incredible change there, and clearly we're going to need to come up with some new rules of the road. How are we going to manage these processes, right? These are new tools. These are instruments of science and technology, whether it's biotech or infotech or whatever. And so this change is radical. It's happening fast, and I'm sure it's going to change our view of society. And it has deep implications for ethics and governance. And the systems that we'll be living by will be really, again, up to us. The second revolution, I would say, I think that's a legacy, and I think we're still living with it. And it's why we see echoes in previous eras. But it's the revolution of inclusion, right? We're still reckoning with creating a fully inclusive society, right? We've been talking about this for over 200 years. You know, we can date it, the rights of man or whatever, but we're still living in this sort of revolution about rights. In coming to the reckoning of the equal worth of every human being, the equal representation of every person in our political system, and not just in our political system, in our community system, in our lives. So I think we're living with that as well. And so to me, this is what I think we're looking at.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt lived through World War I, World War II. The Great Depression, civil rights. So those times were as fraught, as difficult, as confusing, as disillusioning, as hurtful as what we find ourselves in this transition. We're not at war in the world, military war. But we are certainly in a revolution of ideas and practices, and, as you say, living together on this one planet. And that was the beginning. The beginning of this was then. We are deep in the throes of it now, 70 years later.
I think that's important. I think that's important, Manuela. And one of the things I would like to, talk to, particularly among the students and the young people who I hope are watching and listening, is, a revolution is, there should be a sense of excitement in the sense of a creation of a new way to live.
That's right. That's right. I hope. Our students are dying to change the world, engaged, passionate individuals. And Eleanor Roosevelt and Andrew Carnegie made change the driving forces throughout their lives. So what can you tell our young change makers about what the first step might be to become an agent of change?
That's great. I like there's an old phrase. I'm not sure to whom we should attribute it, but an old phrase in sort of you see this in the leadership conversations about leadership, which is you should lead from where you are. And I think to me that's the place to start. Every person, every thinking person, should feel that they are a moral agent, that their choices matter, that what they do has an effect on those around them. And while this may seem like a small thing, I think it's the most profound thing. Because when you talk about revolution, what is revolution, right? We can talk about revolution in social structures and social arrangements and institutions, but the real revolution is in changing how people think, right? In social science, we call that normative shift. When you think something's right and they say, well, wait a minute, no, that's not right, right? The norm has changed. What's expected and required has changed, right? And that, to me, that is the most profound shift. And so when especially when a young person thinks, how do I become a leader? Again, I think it starts with yourself. I mean, and it starts with your own moral compass and you know, that sense of reflection and action. So I know there's a lot of discussion about, you know, means of change, you know, civic engagement and leadership studies and, you know, so on. And I don't mean to put these things down, but I think those things come, you know, down the line. I think the first thing is for individuals to sort of think about what they're committed to, what their values are, what the norms are, what needs to change. And then to set out with intention and purpose to sort of get there.
That's right. That's right. I think Eleanor very much felt that every individual living on the planet is responsible. And that responsibility is a freedom. Thank goodness that we can be responsible. But she of all people, felt very deeply that the responsibility starts when you're about 17 or 18 and does not end. It's an active responsibility, and that each individual comes and is born on this earth with qualities that can be healing and transformational, not only for self, but for the other. So her work was focused on the other. We never see Eleanor Roosevelt focusing on herself. She hardly ever uttered the word I, but it's on the other. So this sense of deep responsibility as a human being toward the other. And you know, if we come to the last chapter in her book,
Manuela, could I
yes,
sorry to interrupt you, but I think there's a very important point I wanted to hear, which to the work on universal human rights. I think this is a very important kind of connection, because when we think about rights, you know, we often think about that, you know, when you said I or me, you know, my rights, right? And we think about rights usually as protections and even entitlements that I have as a human being, but often forgotten in this is that is connected to a sense of duties and responsibilities, right?
That's right.
Yes, we do have inalienable rights that we have by virtue of being human, but to really understand that concept and to make it meaningful in the world, and I think Eleanor would have been the first person to point to this, that these things are connected, that along with these protections and entitlements that I have are a set of duties and responsibilities.
Right. And she famously say, where do human rights begin? They begin close to home, in places so small you may not be able to find them on a map. Today we wake up after another night, a very difficult night here in the United States, where we see that human rights and the questions around constellating human rights have been waged in a way very, very close to each of our homes. I hear friends all over the United States living in boarded up, you know, all the shops are boarded up. There's a riot, police all around, and National Guard and so on. And this is not just here. I mean, it's in Hong Kong, it's in many, many other parts of the world. So the question of human rights remains an open question. Yes, the Declaration was drafted and signed in 1948, but it's unfinished business. So it is something that will touch each one of us several times during our lifetimes. And that responsibility is something to be observed with great care.
I think that's right. I think that's another important point, especially when we talk about something like universal human rights. It's a little bit like leadership as well. Sometimes it's seen as something out there. It's something distant. You know, it's something global. It's something faceless. And you know, I'm glad that you brought attention to this dimension of Eleanor Roosevelt's life and work, which is right. Human rights begin close to home, in these places so close that you don't see them. Right. That it's immediate. It's part of everyday life. It's part of what you do. It's not something out there to be dealt with later, or I'll vote about that, or what. I think this is critical, and I think that you know, another principle that we talk a lot about at Carnegie Council is the principle of fairness. You know, it's a little bit looser than perhaps the idea of rights. You know, rights can tend to be, you know, quite sort of specific, and you know, you claim a right and you can litigate a right, and you know, things like that. Fairness is something a little bit perhaps softer, but maybe a bit more profound, and maybe more you know, sort of relatable in everyday life. One of the things I talk about with students a lot is the idea of fairness, and sometimes it's very hard to sort of come to some general agreement about what is fair, right? It's a very sort of relativistic kind of notion, but I think what we're seeing now is we may have trouble deciding on what is fair, but boy, when you see something that's unfair, you know, that really gets you, right? And I think you can get more. Sometimes you can get universal agreement on things that you just say, this is unfair, this is not right, and we certainly cannot accept something as a norm, right? As something that's just the way we do things. And perhaps one way to look at, you know, what we're seeing now is that needle is changing, right? That, you know, things that before were accepted as the norm, or that's just the way things are, no, that's no longer considered okay. It's no longer fair. That's clearly unfair. Maybe we can't agree on what's fair, but we certainly can agree on what's unfair.
And agree on having a dialogue.
Yeah.
So we want to open up the session for students' questions, and we have many and wonderful questions to answer. The last chapter in Eleanor's book is titled "The Land is Bright." By land, of course, we think of all countries. Then, as now, with population growth exploding, the straining of resources and climate change, Eleanor remained convinced that the future was bright and that it belonged to those believing in the beauty of their dreams. Do you feel our future is bright? How do we absorb the negative trends the past has thrown into our today and transform them for tomorrow?
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's really a question that I, you know, would like to get more input on. I can give you my own personal, my own personal view on it, which is this is a place where the history can be inspiring, and I think this is an important time to take note of where we are. And while we may, you know, feel a sense of despair, feel a sense of outrage, feel a sense of pity, you know, all kinds of emotions. Again, just think back, as you were saying, the example you gave of Eleanor Roosevelt and what she went through and what her generation went through. You know, the Great Depression, World War II, a world that was devastated, you know, completely destroyed. Europe destroyed, Japan destroyed, the use of atomic bombs, right? I mean, you know, imagine, right? I mean, and at that point, when you know, this low moment, you know, the world did come together and formed the United Nations. And, you know, read the preamble again. You know what it dedicated itself to. Then 3 years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the things that followed. And so, literally, the world picked itself up and did not only imagine but create something that was meant to be better and meant to be progressive. in that sense. Just this morning, I was reading an article written by Martin Luther King. It was actually shortly before his death in 1968. And it's a really remarkable piece because it was very much of that moment, of that very fraught moment in 1968 with all kinds of unrest through this country, the war in Vietnam, all kinds of social upheaval, and a lot of reasons to be depressed and to have despair. And yet he would not give in to those impulses. He would not give in. He would not give up. And in fact, the takeaway from that particular article is his absolute dedication to nonviolent, peaceful change. And he makes a practical, strategic, moral argument for his approach to social change, and it's quite passionate. But what I picked up was not only the commitment to nonviolence, which is so critical and so important, we can talk about that, but also to answer your question, Manuela, it was more about his spirit, because you could feel almost the sort of the melancholy in a way, the sense that we're sort of pushing this rock up this hill. It's so hard, and it would be so easy to quit, or to take a time out, and yet his refusal to do that. So anyway, we can all find our inspirations, but I think that it is important to think about those who came before us and those who summoned the energy and the spirit and the enthusiasm to keep going.
Yeah, it can't be quitters, that's for sure.
No.
And it's this end cycle between responsibility of government and responsibility of the individual. So that growth in the responsibility and the need for no abdication on either side of that responsibility is
the part that's so difficult, and you see this in if you think about Eleanor's legacy and also the King legacy, that's so difficult is when you run up against opposition that uses language like domination, right? That uses violence, right? That it's a very hard lift to remain positive, to remain constructive, to remain forward looking. It's not easy, and I think it's okay to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But not to give up.
No. Never give up.
Right.
So I'd like to open it up for questions because they keep coming in. So maybe we can go 5 minutes after 10 a.m. here in the state on the East Coast. So the first question is there an open source curriculum or MOOC, either of all of Carnegie's leadership facilitation frames or specifically of ethics ending poverty? And how does this connect with ethics curricula of Adam Smith at Glasgow University? Do we know?
Thank you. I mean, that's a great, almost a planted question. Thank you. I mean, one of the when you opened up, Manuela, about the Carnegie Council and what we do, I kind of cut that short. But one of our major initiatives is what we call curriculum development, which is to create resources that are available for college and university students, primarily targeted colleges and university, but also can go sort of into the high schools. But to be doing both historical analysis, ethical analysis of public policy issues, and to literally, our ambition has been to change the study of and the teaching of international relations so that the moral and ethical dimension of these issues are fully present. So I can refer this person to our website. There's a great search engine on our website. It's an incredible archive of materials, primary source materials. We have lectures, workshops, seminars, crucially our journal, Ethics and International Affairs, published by Cambridge University Press. It's been published for more than 30 years. We've done a lot of work on war and peace issues, on social justice issues, on climate issues, migration issues, you know, any issue that's sort of a public policy issue that's global in scope, issues relating to inequality and poverty and so on. So yeah, please go on to our website and take a look.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what resources, readings, historical sources do you think we should revisit as we think about shaping the world for the future?
Wow, you've given me an assignment. I should probably come up with a top 10. I'll give you just
a reading list.
But two right on the top of my head that came up in preparation for this conversation. There was a pamphlet that was published by the Carnegie Council in 1957, 58, and it was on the occasion of the coming 10th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's called In Our Hands, and it sort of revisits the Universal Declaration and talks about how to organize community activity, you know, around this, as using it sort of as a study guide. Just think in this moment, going back and looking at that, I found it sort of inspirational to see again that those who came before us had similar things on their mind and were organizing accordingly. There was also this piece by Dr. King that I mentioned that was published. It was actually published in 1972. I think this was a copyright issue, but it was written in 1968. There's something there to look at. The other thing I can just mention here, since we're talking about the Roosevelt legacy, something that Carnegie Council put together some years ago. It was a study guide to the 4 freedoms. And it was something that I was involved in putting together, and I really, I got a lot out of it by providing the editorial assistance on that. And I found that many students have enjoyed it as well. But the idea was to go back and look at the 4 freedoms as kind of a foundational, a moral foundation, you know, the ethical principles that are instantiated in those 4 freedoms, and thinking about them, not only about what it meant in 1941, but what it means today to bring that forward. So that was another publication. But yeah,
maybe we can put a reading list or list of resources and make it available with the recorded talk. Are you working with community partners now, and if so, how? Who?
We are, and our favorite community partner is the BARD OSA network. No, in all seriousness, this is a good example of one. So, you know, we want to be reaching a broad constituency, and in principle, a global constituency, and particularly younger people. And, you know, I had mentioned before, the revolution that we're going through right now is inclusivity, right? And how do we think about being fully inclusive? That is a big ask. But working with BARD and with this network has been inspiring for me personally, and also for the council. We are located in New York City. Our office is on East 64th Street in New York City, and so this represents some opportunities for us, and that is our local community. By coincidence, it's very close to Roosevelt House, which is part of Hunter College and the City University of New York system. And that's been another element of our sort of inclusiveness. We've been trying to work more and more with not only Hunter students, but students in the City University of New York network. Again, that gets you inclusive and global very, very quickly. It's an incredibly diverse student body. And we've really enjoyed working with them. And then also, as you go through, if you go onto our website, you'll see the different projects that we have. And you know, in each of these projects, we've tried to be fully inclusive in terms of bringing in people with different types of experience in working on these issues, whether it's everything from people in the financial sector working on economic issues, or we've worked a lot with journalists who are covering some of these issues in the field. We work a lot with government officials, the UN community. We've worked with the military, particularly the United States military. So, we've really tried to make this so both public-facing and inclusive kind of audience.
So the next question, I think, is for me. How do you think Roosevelt would have shared her experiential learning if she had either been in the middle of global TV media age or indeed digital media age? So she was in her time radio and television and articles. So we consider her the first blogger. She wrote My Day column that was read by millions of people every day for decades, and she wrote about ordinary people she met and what they thought, what they went through, whether it was views that were aligned with her views or views that were completely contrasted to her views. But she gave platform, a very, very inclusive platform. And she was the first lady to invite women journalists to the White House to talk about issues that would touch women. And that was unprecedented. It had never been thought that women might be interested before. And she used radio almost more powerfully more frequently than even FDR with his fireside chats. So I think she would be, right now, she would be tweeting and communicating and appearing on television.
I think, Manuela, I think that's a profound question, and maybe we can organize a conversation around that at some point with some of our friends in communications and journalism. I think this is a really challenging, moment for how do you think about leadership, and how do you think about, progressing, certain types of views in this ecosystem we find ourselves in of social media. I think we're in the early days here, and it's a profound tool of communications, but I think we're trying to find our way. And it's very, very challenging to do that. So I think you're right. It is interesting to think about someone like Eleanor Roosevelt as a sort of the first blogger. I think that's great.
Yeah. So next question, was disinformation as much of an issue? If so, what can we learn? So in terms of disinformation, maybe few people know that Eleanor Roosevelt had the largest FBI file compiled on her than any American in her time. So once you obtain the files through a Freedom of Information Act and you read it, you'd be shocked at the amount of misinformation. I mean, she was accused of everything and anything. Much was misinformation that was put out against her. She was accused of globalism, communism, socialism, internationalism, UNism, any ism she was a leader of, any ism that was against the ethics of the time. So what can we learn? How did she cope with this? She was mindful, but she didn't take it seriously. It wasn't her truth. And she didn't truly engage in fighting it. She largely ignored it, because she felt the essential conversation had to be about curing the divide. And she would waste very precious little time in fighting accusations made against her. She would make fun of it. She would answer questions like, Mrs. Roosevelt, why do you think so many people hate you? Or why so-and-so hates you? And she would say, well, you know, this gentleman obviously has a problem. It's not my problem. So she had a very healthy division between her work and how certain people undermined it. She was undeterred. So that is something that is incredible about her at the time, and that we can learn from. The next question is, what self-care methods would you recommend to current change makers at this time? And this is a very important question, right? The burnout rate can be very high when you're a freedom fighter.
Yeah, I suppose I don't have any particular expertise in that area, but just, you know, I'll just give you based on my own experience. And, you know, I guess I'll go back to my, the idea of looking to examples. You know, we had just done a podcast recently, a webinar at Carnegie Council, a book just written by Ted Widmer, called Lincoln on the Verge. And it's a book about Lincoln's 13-day journey from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. Upon his inauguration, when he leaves Springfield to come to Washington to become president. And in these 13 days, it tells the story of Lincoln. And you think about difficult circumstances. You think about you know, having to overcome. For him, it was personal as well. He was a depressive personality. He suffered bouts of melancholy. He had his own internal demons, if you will, in addition to a country that was literally falling apart and people who literally wanted to kill him. And he had to assume this burden. And so I don't know if this is self-care, but when I read about that and I think about, you know, what people, like a person like him, you know, the exemplar that he was, what he was able to do, what he was able to process, what he was able to overcome, I find inspiration in that. Listen, I think people will find their inspirations in different ways. I don't think there's one way to do that. But I think to be mindful that one is not alone, that people in the past have had these burdens, people around you have these burdens. It's part of the human condition, and just some sense of perspective, I think, is helpful.
Yeah, I think Eleanor Roosevelt's way was to switch off. You know, she was up here in the countryside. She had family, she had grandchildren, she had friends. She was not alone and feeling miserable. She was connected. And sometimes she connected to activists, and sometimes she connected through the heart to her family and friends, and switched off. And that's, I think, self-care is very important. Next question is, as we watch populism take over here in the States and elsewhere, what can we learn from the toolkits of practitioners and activists in history to adopt tactics for today?
So the question, I presume, is how to respond to
Well, what toolkits are available from the past? You know, we've both said that the times Andrew Carnegie and Eleanor lived in were just as challenging as our times are now. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, there's Gandhi, there's Martin Luther King, that many individuals throughout modern history we stand on the shoulders of. So how do we use their toolkits for today, for right now?
So my answer is perhaps somewhat conventional, and maybe I'll switch over to Franklin Roosevelt as a pretty good exemplar of how to think about this. His entering office in 1932, 33, facing tremendous the depression and the challenges, immediate, real-time, acute challenges, and his active engagement, his willingness to listen, to lead, to experiment, to try, and to really be bold and to extend. But also crucially, I think, when I think about Franklin Roosevelt, I think about, his view of leadership was also to educate and to persuade. It wasn't just to follow what the masses wanted or what the people wanted, or he had a view, he had a strong sense of direction, he had a place he wanted to go, and he saw his role as a leader to as in some ways as an educator, right? To persuade. And then why is he so famous for his fireside chats? Well, it was, and this leads up to the war, but the idea is, okay, join me. I'm going to try, I'm going to, in a non-patronizing way, but say, let me try to explain to you, right? This is the way we see the problem, and I'm going to try to persuade you this is what we need to do. And it was a style of leadership that was, maybe better. The best way to put it is to educate or to persuade those to come along, as opposed to this model of of power. I'm going to wield power in a certain way. So to me, those are the leaders that stand the test of time, who bring the people along with them, and to but again, it gets back to what we started out with. It's this balancing act of listening and leading. But I think the leader has an obligation to lead, and has an obligation to persuade and to explain,
to share the vision.
Right.
I would say that Eleanor played a part in his leadership, in the sense that she went to see conditions. She went and talked to people and brought it all back to him. So the compassionate, empathic leadership was a partnership, really, between them, of political vision with deep listening and seeing of the conditions of the people. Mm-hmm. Now, the next question comes from a devil's advocate, and we love devil's advocates. So the student says, I would say reality of American dream and valuing the next generation died in 1962-63 with Kennedy Roosevelt. Kennedy trusted youth to moon races. Presidents since, not so much, especially Nixon, who called youth bombs, and started making college education a process of getting into debt. Can you imagine the next administration valuing only youth worldwide, as well as American, can solve challenges? So OSUN has partners in places like Bangladesh and Ghana. How do we listen to youth and tech on the other side of the world?
Well, there's a lot in that. I think that yes, it's easy to point to failures, of which there are many, but I think we can also point to some improvements if we want to talk about norms or standards or values or what it's expected. Let me just talk about the United States for a moment. We've just lived through a revolution of sorts, right, in terms of how we think about same-sex marriage, just as one example, in a relatively short period of time. And I'm not saying that this problem has gone away or that we don't live in a society that still harbors all kinds of prejudice, but the reality is we went from you know, maybe, what is it, 10, 12 years ago, where it was sort of unthinkable, right, that we would have same-sex marriage, to now it is an accepted law of the land, right? So, and I can give you different examples, or even if we want to switch up and just talk about, you know, how we think about our relation to the climate. You know, we're in the middle of a change of consciousness about this, about what is the human relationship to the natural world, right? You know, we're beginning to think differently, and we're beginning to see in some parts of society genuine change. So I think, you know, it's not linear. It doesn't just, you know, progress. You know, we have back and forth, up and down. But I think, you know, if you're a progressive person, you channel that progressive element, and you think, okay, you know, how do we move things ahead? In terms of thinking about the rest of the world, I think this is a conversation, a separate conversation that we're going to need to have. You know, one of the reasons for real concern right now about what's happening is I did believe that the United States did at least aspire to some sense of global scale leadership around values and norms and standards. And again, we can discuss performance, but I'm talking about aspiration. And probably the best example of this is Eleanor Roosevelt in the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, again, or the establishment of the whole post-World War II order that did have some ethical basis to it. I don't think it's being overly dramatic to say that in 2016 we've walked away from that with, you know, deliberate and intentionally walking away from that kind of leadership. So so I share the concern about the lack of concern of, you know, youth around the world.
Yeah, well, you know, I think this opportunity with BARD and Open Society Universities network and the Taloir network is a good example of cross opportunity for students to come together, and I wish we had much more time to talk with you all, and maybe that's something that we can develop together. But I think youth is the great promise of making tomorrow better than today. So I think participation and engagement at all levels is very, very important.
So Manuela, I think that I think it's very important before we conclude to say what you just said. I'm just going to underline it because, you know, again, from the ethics perspective, and from somebody who believes deeply in democracy, in the open society, the most important element, the quintessential element, is openness. And speaking as an American, I think what has been exceptional about our society until now is that it's remained open. And what I mean by that is it's open to self-correction, right? We still have the means to the four freedoms: freely express, freely worship, and so on. And what's critical now, particularly for young people, is to be aware of that and to be committed to that and to live that. Because as long as we're open, we can correct, right? You know, it goes back and forth, it goes up and down, but it's open, and it you know, what to me the biggest concern is when it closes, right?
So we have 3 more questions. Erin, do we have time? I hope we do.
I'll be quick.
Okay. Joel, how did you find your way to what you're doing today? And what role should an organization like Carnegie play now?
Well, that's great. Thank you for that question. I mean, I started my career, I consider myself an educator. I'm an academic by profession. I studied international relations, foreign policy, and so on. And so the way I find myself to Carnegie Council is I was interested in educating, you know, in the classroom, but beyond the classroom. And, you know, I think Carnegie Council is a public-facing institution, and so it just gave me the opportunity to continue to do what I do, which is to try to be a scholar and an academic, to try to contribute in some way to scholarship, but also to contribute in some way to public life, and to create educational opportunities for more people. So I hope when people think of Carnegie Council, they think of us as a place to come to learn.
Next question. As an older graduate student with the opportunity to impact many people in my community, where should I start to try changing minds and begin learning together to deeply listen? So maybe I can talk about Valkill.
Please.
So the reason we preserve Valkill is because it is a convening place. It always was a convening place. It never was a refuge from international life for Eleanor. But at Valkill, in this very, very simple, almost idyllically simple setting, she invited people of all kinds to sit and have picnics and talk and make important decisions on an individual, social, and global levels. So I would say that we need a lot more Valkills. Valkill is now part of the National Park Service, is open to everyone. You can come and convene there. But if you're too far away, make your own Valkill, make your own place that is a regular place for you to come together and talk and listen and calm the rage by thinking together of positive action. Last question, what ethical principles should we be applying to the events in over 100 cities in the US this weekend? Joe.
Well, thank you. You know, I'll come back to, I think I touched on some of these before, but this is a good way to summarize them. I think that the ethical principle of pluralism, how do we live together with differences, right? And to embrace that in some way. And I think that in some ways that's the quintessential element of our country, of the United States. You know, e pluribus unum, you know, and it's a struggle to achieve that. But that's a principle that we, you know, we have to get behind, and we have to sort of mobilize around, that we're together. As you said, Manuela, we're all in this together. And to be able to somehow get there. I think the principle of rights, again, is essential. It's been a tremendous organizing principle for our society, and we need to make it work for us today. Again, reminding ourselves of the protections and entitlements it means for all of us, and I mean all of us, every person, but also the duties and responsibilities that go along with that. And then I'll leave you with the other, which is fairness itself, and for all of us to be deeply reflective about what that means. And, you know, that goes to, you know, who do we want to be? What kind of a society do we want to live in? What do we think is fair, and how do we make the necessary compromises, perhaps, arrangements, commitments to get there? But those are the principles that I think about when I think about how to apply principles to what we're looking at today.
Right. So Eleanor Roosevelt conducted civil disobedience workshops. So of course there is rage, of course there is catharsis. And catharsis itself can be an endless cycle. It could be catharsis for the sake of catharsis. And we're seeing some of it. So she said that will not necessarily lead to a positive outcome. So her civil disobedience workshops were really structured to see how do we promote and change systemically. So with taking in these very, very, very strong emotions. So an ethical principle is, let's work together and make counter proposals together to what is happening. So citizens' rights, citizens' power is incredibly effective when you can when you can engage. She always maintained the blind rage is justified at individual level, but at the collective level, it's probably going to do more harm than be an agent for change. So, Joel, do you want to add something? We are
No,
at the end of our
I think that's extremely well said, Manuela, and especially today, you know, given what's happening in our society, that the that commitment to civil disobedience, the commitment to nonviolent change, I think it's sometimes misunderstood by the casual observer. You know, to sort of coin a phrase of pop psychology, I think it's better to think about it as being passive aggressive, in the sense of, you know, yes, pacifist, meaning nonviolent, but very strategic, very intentional, and you know, not conflict avoiding, in fact, conflict seeking in some way, right?
That's right.
And so I think that, you know, that's a good cue for all of us to go back and to study and to read and to reflect on that. There's a good tradition that's been given to us, that we inherit, we stand on the shoulders of, the civil disobedience that came before. And again, these were people who were very strategic. They wanted social change. They weren't pacifists in the sense of, oh no, just, you know, I give up. They were fighting, but they were fighting smart.
Yeah.
And they, as they say, kept their eyes on the prize. They knew where they were going. So.
But fight smart is a good thought. Yeah. So thank you everyone for being with us today, and I hope you'll join us for the next Tomorrow's Now conference. And again, Joel, it's been such a pleasure having you as our honored guest and listening to your wisdom and vision for a better tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.